Three.
Two Australian journalists were forced to flee China this week following the detention of another Australian journalist. Why? What's going on?
Well, what we've seen is a ratcheting up in the tensions between Australia and China. This is something that's been building for the last 3 or 4 years since Australia introduced its foreign interference and anti-foreign influence laws. But the difficulties in the Australia-China relationship have been building, and a lot of it's been about the tone in our communications with China and China reacting somewhat negatively to that and perceiving Australia to be something of the mouthpiece or the sheriff of the United States, of Washington, D.C. and the region. It's got particularly bad this year since the Australian government called for an independent inquiry into the COVID outbreak in China, which seemed to point the finger directly at China, and China wasn't happy with that. Without going back over all of those details again, this has continued to get a little bit worse with tit-for-tat reactions between the two countries on a number of things. The journalists seem to have been targeted after it now transpires. ASIO had called in a number of Chinese journalists for questioning in relation to an investigation into a New South Wales Member of Parliament and one of his staffers for being influenced by China or somehow being affected by Chinese attempts to influence Australian politics. The situation has got worse, and that could have implications for business.
What does that mean for Australian businesses in China? Has the risk of doing business in China increased? What are you advising your clients?
So since the arrest of the journalist Chang Lei and the two Australian journalists fleeing China rather hurriedly this week, just arriving back the other day, I have had a number of my clients calling me and saying, what do I think the implications are for them, for their businesses in China, and what should they be doing, particularly in relation to their employees in China who happen to be Australian citizens or have permanent residency status in Australia, whether they should be considering getting them out of China. And I've been advising them that I think they should. I think they have, at this point, a duty of care to those people. They really do have to think about them because the risks are going up. The fact is that journalists have been targeted because ASIO had questioned a couple of Chinese journalists here in Australia. The fact is that we've also taken away the visas or revoked the visas of a couple of Chinese academics. So we could expect that the Chinese government might decide to target Australian academics next. So if I was a university and I had Australian citizens in China working at the moment on a research project, I'd be looking at getting them out. I would be saying to researchers looking at going to China now, it's not a good time, let's hold off on that. The fact is that we might be questioning as Chinese business people. When I say we, I of course mean ASIO, might start to question a Chinese businessman living and working in Australia. How would China react with that? And we have to keep in mind that a couple of months ago, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade actually issued a travel warning, a travel advisory against traveling to China at this time because of the risk of arbitrary arrest. That's what Australian business is facing now, and I would definitely be advising, or I am definitely advising my clients that they should consider pulling their Australian staff working in China out at this time. And even once COVID has, the travel restrictions because of COVID have been lifted, I wouldn't be sending my Australian employees into China at this time.
Are there any businesses or sectors that are especially vulnerable?
I think there are a number of business areas and sectors that are especially vulnerable, and those are the areas that work in terms of business intelligence. They're gathering information, they're analyzing information. That quite often involves them having to speak to people in the Chinese government to try to get that information. China's security laws are so broad, you could easily be targeted under those for just asking questions about what's happening with government policy, how is it likely to change, so you're trying to analyze its business. So if you're working in anything to do with gathering business information, information on Chinese government policies. For example, the area I worked in China for 13 years, public affairs, that's what we were doing a lot of. We were gathering information from Chinese government officials to try to understand the direction policy might be going in, and then advising clients on what they should do. We were also involved in trying to lobby the Chinese government on things to open up particular sectors or to grant a particular client a license in their sector. Those sorts of areas are likely to come under attention, under scrutiny of the Chinese government, and those are the sorts of areas you could expect them to target Australians or even other foreigners working in China.
How does the situation today compare with 3 years ago when UTS professor Chung Yifeng was detained in China?
3 years ago, I actually worked with UTS when Professor Chung Yifeng was detained there. And I think the significant difference between what had happened at that time and what is happening now is back then there was an ability to still have a quiet, behind doors discussion with people in the Chinese government to be able to negotiate a release of a person. I don't think you can do that now. So when Professor Feng was arrested and detained in China, it was possible to have discussions with the Chinese Consul General in Sydney, with the ambassador in Beijing. It was possible for the Department of Foreign Affairs to have discussions with people in Beijing so we could negotiate a release, and in fact we managed to have him released in a couple of weeks. I don't think that situation, that is the current situation. I think it is now much more difficult. I think it would even be difficult to get that sort of meetings with key people here in Australia, the Consul General or the ambassador, for the businesses representing those people. It's all got to be done by DFAT now, and it's not going to be as easy to have those direct discussions.
Do you see an end in sight to the current tensions in Australia-China relations?
If you had asked me that question just a matter of weeks ago, I would have said yes, I was quite optimistic. And I was heartened by the fact, or by two facts. The first was that during the Australia-US ministerial meeting in Washington, D.C., when Foreign Minister Maurice Payne was asked whether Australia would participate in the US Navy's freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, she made it very clear that Australia would not be doing that, but would in fact assess each request on a case-by-case basis and make a decision based on what is in our national interest. That was an important message to Washington, and it said that Australia has its own national interests and would not always be joining with Washington in what might be in the US's national interest. I think that was also an important message to Beijing, to let Beijing know very clearly that we are not the sheriff of the US or the deputy sheriff in the region. We, in fact, decide what is in our best national interest, and our national interest does not always align with the US, nor does it always align with Beijing. Beijing is important to us. We have a very important economic and trade relationship with China. We will sometimes have to make decisions based on that, but we also have our own national security concerns to consider, and we will also make decisions based on that. Very important message to both countries, and I was hoping that Beijing would see that for what it was and see that there was an opportunity to now deal as an equal partner with Australia, with Canberra again, and that we could get the relationship back on an even keel. Importantly, in the last couple of weeks, we also saw the Chinese Deputy Chief of Mission of the Chinese Embassy in Canberra give an important speech to the National Press Club. It was a very good speech. You may not agree with everything that was in it. There were some bits that Australian media and other people have taken a little bit out of context and pointed fun at. But the important thing in the speech was that there seemed to be an olive branch being laid down, where Deputy Chief of Mission Wang Xining pointed out that we have had a very strong relationship since Australia opened relations with Beijing back in 1972. There's been a strong friendship there. It's been based on trade, but it's also been based on people-to-people contacts and cultural exchanges, and that they seem to be an olive branch there where he seemed to be saying, let's get back to our relationship based on friendship. That seems to have just dissipated in the last 2 weeks, partly in response to something that's been going on for the last couple of months, where ASIO has been investigating an advisor to a member of the upper house of the New South Wales Parliament, and that investigation included questioning 2 Chinese journalists based in Australia. The result of that has been perhaps China detaining the Australian journalist Cheng Lei, who worked for the Chinese national broadcaster, and also saying to 2 Australian journalists, one from the Fin Review, one from the ABC, that they wanted them to come in for questioning. That resulted in them and their organizations taking advice from DFAT and the decision being made to get them out of China, and they've arrived back in Australia, thankfully safely. But what we've seen is a complete ratcheting up in that relationship. And what we are seeing now is a continuation of that. We've now found out that 2 Chinese academics who were working in Australia doing research have had their visas revoked. So there is now a risk that that could be ratcheted up further, with maybe China targeting Australian academics working in China, or Australian business working in China. So right now, I'm not optimistic that we are going to see that there is an end in sight to all of this, because we seem to be stuck in a tit-for-tat tactical game, with neither side having any real strategy to get us out of the current difficulties and tensions in the relationship, to get them back on an even keel, where we can talk to each other, where our ministers can pick up the phones to each other and have a conversation about the difficulties in the relationship.
What can Australian businesses do to mitigate their risks, given that these tensions are likely to continue indefinitely? Can they diversify to other export markets, and which markets?
So there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years from the Australian government, from Canberra, telling Australian business they really need to start to diversify, because the China relationship has become so difficult and the risks of putting all of our eggs in the one basket. That's true. It's always risky to put all of your eggs in the one basket. The problem we have is that for the last 30 years, we decided China was the market we had to be in. We've encouraged Australian business to engage with that market, to export to that market, to invest in that market, and they've been doing that. But we should have been thinking about diversification from the beginning, or certainly 10 or 15 years ago. You can't diversify overnight. Telling us for the last couple of years, and especially now, you need to diversify. Well, China takes 42% of our exports. We are not going to find any other market that will take 42% of our exports. It's our single largest tourist market. It is our single largest source of foreign students coming to Australia. You can't just overnight find other markets to replace all of those students or replace all of those tourists. It's going to take time to build it. In terms of a long-term strategy, yes, absolutely, Australian business needs to be looking at what other markets are there and start building them. But it's not going to happen in the next 6 months, it's not going to happen in the next 12 months or 24 months. It's probably going to be a decade long before we can find other markets that we can start to build up to replace what we will be losing in the China market if the current tensions continue.
Is your firm able to assist Australian businesses seeking to diversify their exports or invest in countries other than China?
Well, importantly, my firm doesn't only focus on the China market. While I spent 13 years in China and I have that expertise, I also understand international trade. I've worked in international trade for the past 30 years, and I have got relationships in other markets. I've got an international network of various people that I've known, companies that I've dealt with in the past that can help with other markets. And just recently I have signed an MOU within a company in India, Cretum Advisory, which can help, and specifically saying that, to help Australian businesses to access the India market, whether it's for exporting product, whether it's to import product from India, or whether it's to invest in India, or maybe to joint venture or work with Indian companies wanting to invest in Australia. That's a company that can do that. And I've always been very positive and optimistic about the Indian market. In terms of size, it's a similar size to the Chinese market. It's over 1 billion people. It's about 1.1 billion people now. It's got a large middle class, about 300 million. Not too different from China. What's really important with the Indian market to keep in mind is it's based on a Western democratic system that it inherited from the Westminster system because of that period of English rule, of British rule. It has a court system, it has rule of law, and those things make it a very positive market to look at and to want to work with.